All right, so let's talk about cells, specifically prokaryotic cells versus eukaryotic cells. So, first of all, let's kind of break these words down. When you see the word prokaryote, you can break it down into two basic parts. Here you have the word pro. Pro means, and let me bring this right here down below, before. Right, so you have the word before right here, and then on this side you have the word karyote. Right, and so when you think of the word karyote, karyote means kernel. A kernel, like a kernel of corn, like a seed type of thing. So when you're thinking about that in terms of the cell, prokaryote means before kernel or before there was a nucleus, right? So when you think of the word kernel, it's basically referring to, oops, this way right here, basically referring to this right here, the nucleus. So prokaryotes came before there was a nucleus, and that's why you see the DNA just kind of hanging out right here with nothing protecting it. That thing that protects it over here in this cell is called a nucleus, and this guy didn't evolve one, right? These came before that. So there you have a prokaryote, right? Before there was a nucleus. And then on this side, and let me move this down a little bit. On this side right here, you have this right, these two letters, U, E and U. And when you're seeing these two words, that means true. So right here you have true, and then on the other side you have the word again, karyote, which is kernel. But remember, we kind of translate that into nucleus. But let me go ahead and put that here, kernel. I'll even put this here. Oh, not sorry, not DNA, nucleus. And I kind of got messed up with that because the DNA goes inside the nucleus. But here you have kernel, you can think of it as a nucleus. And so this one actually has a true nucleus. So those are the main differences between a prokaryote and a eukaryote, and a good way to be able to kind of tell those two apart. But we'll dive into all of these little diagrams that you see that are labeled here. We'll go ahead and dive into that in the slides to come. So, what are the main characteristics of organisms? And so we talked about organisms a while back, but just a little refresher. Remember, organisms are made of cells. They obtain and use energy, so they have to eat food in order to do whatever it is that they need to do, right? Any kind of physical activity. Even taking a breath uses up energy. Number three, they maintain homeostasis. So when you're thinking of homeostasis, that's kind of a balance. I always like to think of it as like biological balance, right? If an organism gets too cold, it can, it's harmful for it. It could even die. If it gets too hot, it can possibly die, right? If its blood is too acidic, it can die. If its blood is too alkaline, it can die. There's so many different possibilities, right, that can lead to an organism being sick or eventually dying. And by not maintaining that homeostasis, then that is, very likely it's not going to end well for that organism. It responds to stimuli and environment. So every living thing will respond to a stimulus. If you're thinking about yourself, if someone were to poke you with a pin, that would kind of make you jump, right? Or if someone shone a really bright light in your face, that'd probably make you flinch, right? That is us responding to stimuli. But even microscopic single cell organisms will respond, some to light, some to heat, some to the cold, but they will respond because, again, that is a characteristic of a living thing. They grow and develop, right? So throughout all these living things, there is a life cycle, and they will grow and develop, and eventually, pass away. Reproduce. Every living thing reproduces. Even your cells reproduce. There's a part of the cell's life cycle because the cell does have a life cycle. A cell is born, it lives, it does whatever it has to do, it eats, it drinks, it releases waste, and eventually it dies. But a lot of times they reproduce before they die. And then a living thing or an organism will evolve and adapt. And remember, y'all, we're talking about evolution and adaptations. We're not talking about like one single organism in a lifetime, but it's species throughout like thousands and thousands of years. Although I guess that's not true for single cell like bacteria and things like that. They actually can evolve very quickly. And so, yeah, and they're also considered to be alive. Right, so we're going to dive into these levels of organization. We talked about the levels of organization in an ecological environment, right? And we talked about communities and ecosystems and the biomes, biosphere. But now we're diving down into smaller, even into the microscopic levels of organization, right? Which starts with the atom and then a molecule. And we talked about these macromolecules. Remember these biomolecules? lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids. And we're going to discuss these organelles and then the cells. And eventually, if we have enough time, we'll get to tissues. But this is kind of where our focus is going to be today. Right? But you can see you go from a tissue to an organ system, and eventually an organism. So cell theory, y'all, whenever you hear the word theory used in science, it's not the same thing as what people say a theory is like in everyday life, right? So if you're out talking to people out on the street, they may say something like, "Oh, I have a theory why so and so is a jerk," or something like that. And if they're using the word theory in that sense, then it doesn't really mean what it means in science, because in science, a theory is something that no one has disproven yet, right? People have done research, they've done experiments, and nobody has disproven this piece of knowledge, and so it's considered a theory. And in this case, the cell theory, it's just something that has not been disproven yet, right? So as of now, this theory is still yet to be disproven. So the first part of cell theory is that all living things are made of cells, right? And you can see down here, these are actually some pictures of cells. And the reason they call them cells is because when someone first looked at these through a microscope, they kind of look like the cells in a monastery, which is where monks live, right? But basically, they look like rooms, right? Each one of these, a cell is just another name for a room, right? And so when you see these, they all look like cells, right? Like little rooms next to each other. Same thing over here. And you can probably guess what kind of cells these are right here, right? Just look at the color, right? So these are plant cells, right? They have that green color to them. And so that's how you can tell that these are plant cells. They have green in them, but this green is not, it's more like a paint that they use to color these cells when they look at them through the microscope, right? But these are animal cells over here. They have a more roundish shape. These are kind of a little bit more squarish. But the first part again is that all living things are made of cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in an organism. Basically, cells are they're the basic unit of life, right? They're the basic building block of life. And so here you see that is the second part, right? And again, no one has disproven this. Then part C is that cells come from the reproduction of existing cells. So basically, all that means is all cells come from pre-existing cells. No cell is really just spontaneously created, right? It has to come from a cell that already existed. And so what's kind of messed up though is like, well, I don't know, some people consider unethical, but there are actually people who have passed away who their cells are still reproducing right now. It's something that, some people consider unethical because this person really doesn't have permission anymore, didn't give permission for people to be using these cells, but these cells are still being used for research, even though, again, these people have been dead for decades. And so cells and types of cells. Cells are the basic unit of organisms, right? We just talked about that all living things are made up of cells, or some things are just made up of one cell, right? And they can only be observed under microscopes. And so, although I've actually read that ostrich eggs are actually one of the largest cells that are in existence, and an egg is pretty big, and it is a cell, right? A lot of people don't think of eggs as cells, but they are cells. And so, three basic types of cells we see here: the animal cell, the plant cell, and the animal and the plant cell. Remember, those are eukaryotics, right? They're eukaryotic cells because they have this nucleus right here, right? True nucleus. Eukaryote means true nucleus. But these guys over here, these prokaryotes, remember, these came before cells had a nucleus. And so if you were able to see inside them, you wouldn't see a nucleus. You would just see their DNA kind of doing this right here, just be kind of hanging out right here, uh, all spaghetti looking, thread looking. Uh, Set like remember, well, we'll talk about that later when DNA condenses into chromosomes, but in prokaryotes it just hangs out there freely. There is no nucleus protecting it the way you see here in the eukaryotic cells.